Hello everyone, my name is Valentina Ravioli, and today for our sustainable transportation assignment, I will be talking about three specific local policies that governments could realistically implement to reduce the greenhouse carbon emissions produced by transportation. These three sort of local policies that I'm going to be discussing today relate to zoning and land use reform, active mobility infrastructure, as well as public transit management in a way that could improve both sustainability and the quality of life of the residents. I think before starting, I want to make sure we talk about the importance of why local transportation emissions matter and why we should be paying attention to them. This is one of the huge challenges that local governments face on a daily basis. For instance, transportation is actually the biggest contributor to greenhouse emissions in most communities. We can see this in the graph that I added to the slide. We can see that between pollution created from aviation and gasoline consumption, we're reaching about almost 40% of local greenhouse emissions. This graph is only related to Massachusetts. However, if this is happening in a sort of smaller state in New England, I guess this could directly translate to what happens in larger, bigger states that even have more residents and more vehicles, such as, for example, California. So this is a big issue. This graph also tells us the US tendency to car dependency overall, especially when it comes to single occupancy vehicles. On another note, local governments may not necessarily control the vehicle technology or the building of the actual cars, but they do control a lot of the built environment and the policy behind its regulations. So, for instance, how the land is zoned, how streets are designed, how parking is managed. And as a result, the decisions they make end up affecting and determining the way of life of every single resident, pretty much, as well as all the environmental and health impacts that these may come with. So for my first local regulation, I'm focusing on how to have better land use and sort of talk about a zoning reform based on equity. So local governments can use these kinds of zoning reforms to reduce car dependency and therefore reduce greenhouse emissions. This reform would basically be mostly based on transit-oriented development, TOD, as a way to encourage more compact and mixed-use neighborhoods that are near transit routes. So this would clearly decrease the use of vehicles that create these high carbon emissions. Things would be closer, there would be less commuting time, possibly also incentivizing things like affordable housing near transit. As we can see in this graphic, there's a lot of different benefits that come with TOD. Aside from the ones already mentioned, we're talking about how it stimulates the local economies, it improves public health, as well as, of course, promoting sustainability. There's a lot of communities that I feel like are trying to incorporate TOD nowadays, but definitely it's important to consider the context, the local politics, and how there might be some pushback that some communities might have when presenting something like TOD. And as a result, I think thinking creatively, like building community workshops so that both residents and local officials can be more aware of why it would be important to incorporate something like TOD and have this sort of zoning reform take place. Another idea could be based on giving inclusionary zoning incentives, as well as building towards having more public benefits that could be useful to the whole community and not just to a specific group of people. So yeah, overall, this regulation would be directed to reducing community stress, commuting time, and overall improving community connection. For the second regulation, we're talking about active and shared mobility infrastructure. So this would basically mean trying to make sustainable transportation more realistic and taking into account how local governments need to design mobility systems that actually prioritize people and non-vehicles, which I guess would be the current system. One key planning tool that I discover is the hierarchy of mobility that basically visually ranks transportation modes by sustainability and social benefit. So this hierarchy basically guides sort of like the design of mobility hubs. So we're talking about buses, bikes, walking paths. and kind of puts pedestrians and cyclists and public transit in a higher level than shared vehicles. And also at the end of the chain, at the end of the hierarchy, private cars would be, of course, because they produce the highest amount of pollution and emissions overall. This regulation would focus on encouraging more active and shared transportation options that can replace many short daily single occupancy vehicle trips. Incorporating something like complete streets policies could ensure that something like a new road project can also support things like biking and walking and other sort of transit. A specific example that could represent what I'm trying to suggest with this new regulation could be having a bus stop area connected to different like bike racks and pedestrian paths to then again offer more connectivity and less emissions overall, while also promoting a healthier lifestyle and benefiting the community. For my last regulation, I will be focusing on public transit and how to develop more smart travel management through some of the technology we currently work with in our daily lives, such as apps. This strategy would focus also on improving how people move by basically managing demand and using smart technology to reduce unnecessary driving, which is one of the biggest contributors to local greenhouse emissions. I think it's important to define that travel demand management, so exactly what we're trying to tackle with this regulation, refers to two different types of commuting, one being daily travel, like getting to work, getting to school, etc. Whereas we're also taking into account non-commute travel time. So this would be going to a friend's house, traveling to a different city, etc. So it's sort of prioritizing, yes, like our daily things, but also things that are related to recreation, which is part of our daily lives as well. I think bus rapid transit lanes and incorporating signal priority systems to make buses faster, more reliable can definitely attract more riders and cut per person emissions compared to car travel. And cities could use something like mobility management apps that can integrate these buses while also incorporating bike lanes and share rides into one singular platform so that it would be easier for everyone to be on the loop with what's happening with transit in a certain day. I think these apps could also feature some sort of showing of the lowest carbon route in real time and how it compares to, for example, other kinds of transit, so that hopefully people would be inclined to take something like biking or public transit rather than just driving alone on a certain day and time. And lastly, I think employee commute programs, so kinds of programs where you reward people for carpooling or taking transit instead of just driving, could definitely be very effective in a lot of different sectors. So in short, I would say that this specific regulation kind of tries to tackle how sustainability and sustainable choices can actually be seen as the easier, faster, and cheaper option rather than just driving. And overall, just making a system that is reliable for access to work, different services, but also leisure. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.